Welcome to the Wisepreneurs Project, where wisdom meets entrepreneurship. I'm Nigel Rawlins and I provide down-to-earth practical advice to help people over 50, most often women, navigate the shift to independent professional work. I focus on providing you with actionable insights and expert advice to optimise your life and work, from highlighting productivity, health and cognitive agility to mastering business, marketing and knowledge management. I want to help you survive, grow and thrive as an independent professional. In this episode, we explore how cultural attitudes shape our perceptions of ageing with Natasha Ginnivan, an Australian researcher specialising in this field. Discover practical insights on longevity, combating ageism, healthy ageing, and redefining retirement for continuous growth. Natasha also shares her initiative, Edgy Elders, which promotes positive ageing through conversation and stylish products. Welcome, Natasha, to the Wisepreneurs podcast. Could you tell us something about yourself and where you're from?
Oh, great, Nigel. Good to be here. So I'm Natasha Ginnivan. I'm a researcher. I live and work between the Blue Mountains of Sydney, and I research ageing and attitudes to ageing.
The first thing I notice about ageing is it's spelt differently in different parts of the world. So which one do we use in Australia?
I use the spelling with E because that's what we've learnt and grown up with, but occasionally I will use without the E, A-G-I-N-G, because on LinkedIn posts or social media posts, a lot of people are used to using the unspelling as well.
Yeah, that worries me too, because often when we write things or write articles or put things into social media or somewhere, they'll often search using a search term. So I don't know how the two spellings will work. So tell me something about ageing. You've been studying it now. So what made you want to study ageing, and tell us something more about that?
Thanks for that question. I'll try and give the executive summary. I used to be in my first career a fashion designer. I used to work in product development when I first came out of high school. Yeah, I did like a TAFE course, and then I worked for a decade in product development in the sort of volume side of things. And then as I approached my 30s or early 30s, I was needing something else. I think we go through transitions and change as we get older and find meaning in different things. So I went back and studied psychology at UNSW, and I was a mature student in my 30s comparatively to everybody else. But I came across one of the first projects I did was on implicit attitudes to aging and cultural attitudes to aging, and learnt about stereotypes, things like that. And so that sparked an interest then. And then I went on to do an honours year and was fortunate to be able to study a PhD in psychology and aging at the School of Population Health at ANU, the Research School of Population Health. But I was also funded by, at the time, there was a Centre of Excellence in Population Aging Research, who was interested in all different kinds of dimensions around aging, or sort of economic impacts, the social impacts, the health impacts. And so I fit into the cultural attitudes or attitudes to aging that really impact the way we view aging. And quite often our views of aging are harbored below the level of conscious awareness. So a lot of the stereotypes and attitudes to aging are very automatic, and we probably don't have an accurate view of aging because of that, because we tend to lump into categories of young or old rather than this sort of lifelong process of transition and change that's very individual, and we become very different from one another and diverse as we get older. But we're fighting a stereotype that says we're all the same. You know what I mean? But anyway, that's a long answer, but that's how it sparked my interest from that very first topic. And then I just kept studying it. And then I guess in some ways tried to incorporate my own sort of desire to have meaning and purpose, things like that. Yeah.
One of the problems I have with aging is, what is old age? When is somebody old?
Yeah, look, that's a question that it comes with different dimensions. I think from I would say policy perspective, we somehow think that 65 is the retirement seniors age, because that's attached to policy and things like that. But as we are living much longer, there's longevity. We're living up to our 80s and 90s now. And so 60 is young or 65 is young. But having said that, I don't really feel comfortable just looking at age from that binary of young versus old. I think as a society, we're still hung up on that, like our attitudes have not kept pace with this longevity that we've been blessed with. And I think transitions like life across the life course, and if we're lucky enough to have that long life, it's going to be full of 4 or 5 or 6 or more major transitions. And so the old sort of model that a lot of people in this space talk about, will learn and retire, just doesn't really fit anymore. And I think our institutions, our attitudes, struggling to keep up with this longevity that we have.
That makes me think about the books, The 100-Year Life, that Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott wrote,
Great.
saying that the traditional model is the 3-stage life. You go to school, you go to work, and you retire, and then you spend a lot of time. And I think the audience to the Wisepreneurs podcast is probably in the part where they're probably post-work, but they're starting other careers or continuing their career to work in other areas too. But there's a whole lot of things involved in that, and was one of the reasons I want to talk to you about is how we actually age. I remember talking to a chap a couple of years ago. I've got the seniors card because I'm over 60. And I was saying to him, isn't the seniors card good? And he looked at me and he said, when can you get one? And I said, when you're 60. And he said, oh, I've got a few years. I thought the guy was about 80. He looked so old. And that's the problem. Some people can look old at 40. And that's the thing we're up against. I just started Krav Maga this year, which I really love. I exercise a couple of hours a day. I walk as much as I can. And there are people like me out there who are still reading, working in their late 60s, 70s. And then there's others who aren't.
Sure. The thing is also, is I think part of our attitudes to aging are pinned to some degree to appearances because we're socialized that way. Print, whether it's magazines, whether it's online, whether it's movies, we very much attach the idea of young and old to appearance. And there's something around a bit of opportunity to self-reflect and say, it doesn't matter whether we look older or younger. And I think we're not really up to that stage yet. I think we still very much attach appearance to whether we look young or look old, and we're still fighting against that. And that probably whether we look or feel or are old and frail or not, perhaps shouldn't really define whether we can still contribute to life, have purpose, have meaning, have relationships, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the issues. When you look at somebody and they look old, you're saying that we, for some reason in our culture, we're not feeling that they're up to scratch or as capable as, say, younger people. But the problem I find with that is some younger people don't have the wisdom that the older have, or nor do they have the patience.
Yeah, look, that's a really good point. And in my sort of research and looking at age stereotypes, to some degree, it cuts both ways. Sometimes we stereotype younger people, but also when we're young, it's impossible to be wise from day dot, isn't it? So we learn from experiences and become wise by those cumulative experiences and knowledge. But there's a really great quote, I think it's Oscar Wilde, who says, wisdom comes with age, but sometimes it comes alone. So it doesn't mean that because you are older or old that you're going to be wise necessarily. And then again, there are some people who have wisdom beyond their years as well. But in general, I think you're right. I think that obviously if you're blessed enough to have a longer life, those cumulative experiences of whether it's tragedy, trauma, heartache, all those things tend to give somebody more of a sense of what life is about and gives you wisdom.
Let's have a talk about healthy aging. Is this an issue that you're involved with?
My studies haven't been as directly involved with the health side of it. I do have colleagues who look at brain health and dementia and even like physio and what are the kind of predictors of of health, not drinking too much and not having too much sugar and getting good sleep, don't smoke, all those sorts of things. I've been in aging research enough to know what the predictors are of good or poor health or longevity. Interestingly, one of the main drivers of longevity is social connection, actually, above, I think, all the other health tick box things. But yeah, so I'm indirectly involved in healthy aging, but predominantly my focus is on attitudes, which does impact your expectation of aging, actually.
Maybe we should talk about cognitive health then. Is that an area that's of interest to you as well?
Yeah, it's definitely of interest to me. I'm not an expert in dementia, but I know a little bit about factors, high risk factors for dementia.
Yeah, because that's the biggest fear as we age. Like I'm 68 and I'm thinking, I'd hate to get dementia because it would just stop everything I'm enjoying doing. So one of the things I am interested in through healthy aging and longevity and stuff like that is being able to continue to work professionally and therefore keep my cognitive ability, be able to think clear-headed. And you mentioned alcohol before. I've virtually given up alcohol because that really creates a brain fog the next day. And I'll be honest, I got a bit bored with my business several years ago, so I took a part-time job just to get some time out, and I worked in a liquor store, and it horrified me, the amount of alcohol that people bought, and you'd see the same people every day. And so I'm just wondering, I know that's an issue. I finished that a couple of years ago, and so I'm full-time doing what I'm back to doing, but that cognitive health is just so important. And so what can you tell us about that?
As I mentioned, I'm not entirely an expert, but the things I do know about the relationship with alcohol and brain health is that apparently you can have a very small amount of wine. I think from like the Mediterranean diet type thing, that's the best diet. And I think a little wine is okay. But beyond that, the copious amount of alcohol, I think as a nation that we have probably doesn't help our risk factors for good brain health. I think that alcohol and then just sugar in our diets and salt are probably very big no-nos, I would say, for trying to maintain good brain health as we get older.
So to really age well, I guess what we've got to do is have a look at what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah, look, there's that. But on the other hand, I would just also say that sometimes, addiction to something like alcohol, there's an underlying issue to that as well. So we need to look at like the stress side of our life as well and what's causing us as a country to be so inebriated and want to have to drink all the time. So that would be what's underneath the behaviours.
As we're living longer, it's pretty obvious that if you started drinking as a young person and it's become a habit, suddenly 50 years later, or even 20 or 30 years later, you've been drinking for 20 or 30 years. It must be affecting them. And I guess part of our cultural understanding, it must be hard. So what are some of the attitudes to aging that you're studying?
I would say my initial kind of thesis and research that I did was looking at different cultural attitudes. For example, I contrasted Australia with the Philippines and did some focus groups and surveys. I chose the Philippines because it's a collectivist culture and I also have Filipino heritage myself. And I grew up with, on my mother's side at least, far more intergenerational connection with aunties and a big family. And it's interesting that there is this sort of sense of elder respect, if you like, but it's hard to describe. It's not in the way that like we think just because you're older, you automatically get respect. It's more about in such a close collectivist culture where you're much more tied intergenerationally and involved with each other. It's a mechanism for keeping group harmony and reciprocity and things like that. And it's hard to describe exactly in our Western sense of how we should be between generations. But on the other hand, in sort of Western cultures, we tend to be quite age segregated, both in our kind of societies and families and things. We have extended family, but we don't have as much connection with older people through our life course. And so I wanted to understand if you grew up with more people older than you around that you had a quality relationship with, would this impact your attitude to not only your own aging, but aging in general? And I found with my research, both qualitatively in focus groups and quantitatively via surveys, using these validated scales about culture and attitudes that was validated by the World Health Organization, that there were significant differences, that if you did grow up with those more sort of collectivist culture, intergenerational connection, and had more positive attitudes or views, you did in general have better attitudes to aging. But in my survey, it wasn't just to say that it was only Filipinos because they're collectivists that had better attitudes. I also found that the Australians who were higher on that score of collectivism, or their attitudes were more collectivist, like in their approach to generations, had better attitudes. And there is other research aside from mine that shows that if you have better quality relationships with older people in your life, then of course it's going to impact the way you view yourself as you get older, or how you view older people in general.
I think that's a very interesting point, and a very important one too, because I know that I came from England as a young child with my parents. When I had my children, my parents moved up to Queensland, up where it's lovely and warm, and we rarely saw them. So we had to make an effort to get up there, and it's a bit hard when you've got 3 kids to go to Queensland. So they separated themselves. But I've noticed that my children, I've got 3 grown-up children, one lives in Canada, one lives in Melbourne, one lives locally, but he's about to take off around Australia. So I will rarely get to see them. I can talk to them. It seems to be the thing. I don't know if it's in the West or in Australia, where we just go our own way and we're often on our own. And I can understand when somebody's older, especially men tend to die younger than women. If that's the case and you're a woman and you're older, you're probably living on your own. And unless you're lucky, you've got friends around you. We are very different in Australia, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think it's not one's better than the other. It's just that's the nature of the way they're socially organised. That's just how it's worked out. I think that perhaps attitudes to aging have become more negative as we've ironically gained more longevity. Our attitudes to aging have become more negative. Back before pre-industrial age or whatever, we tended to still be a little bit more in these family groups. But then as the industrial age grew and technology came, you had to go where the work is. So you just brought your kids along and you can't have the whole clan. And then, of course, they're going back through history with the printing press and books and things, and we don't really rely so much on the wisdom of elders or storytelling and things like that as much as we did. And then I think now we've gained a lot. Not to say that these things are bad, they're good. On the one hand, they have strengths, but on that saying, like, the greatest strength can be the greatest weakness as well. I think also now we're exposed to these age stereotypes that infiltrate like our lives, and even storybooks and cartoons and things like that. Children as young as 4 have already formed age stereotypes before they've even gone to school.
It's funny, my wife has a 4-year-old grandchild who is quite an independent little one, was reading since she was 2, constantly wants to come and stay with us on her own without her parents. And she does. She's quite interesting in that regard. She's got some sort of connection there. All right, what about work? People working who are in their 60s and maybe 70s, is it possible for them to still work, or is ageism working against them?
I would say it is possible. And I would also say that, yes, ageism is working against even over 50. My colleagues and I a few years ago did a scoping review to see what types of evaluations and programs are in place to reduce this level of age discrimination that happens to people in their 50s and so on, 70s and older. And what we found after reviewing both literature, academic literature and reports and grey literature and things like that, that trying to find programs that have been seriously trying to evaluate how to reduce this issue, because obviously the last decade we've had a lot more in the equity, diversity, inclusion space, but not for aging really. That's still lagging. And what we found from this scoping review was about 17 studies that really looked at it on how to measure and track and change, because you can't change something that you don't track. And there was only 17 studies across the last 30 years. So given the prevalence of the issue, we only have 17 studies, many of them using college participants, which isn't really serious. It is serious. It's a good study, but you don't have it in the workplace. You don't have people in the workplace trying to actively work on how to perhaps do job sharing or make sure that age diversity is included within your EDI, things like that. So it is a big barrier, and it's something that I think as a culture we really need to take a look at, and not do it in a way that's subsidizing companies that decide they'll begrudgingly take on someone in their 50s and 60s. Just be inclusive and understand that people who are older have a lot of experience to offer and a lot of, as you said, wisdom. They might need some flexibility, but there's not something that you can't offer as a business.
I noticed if I go to the local supermarket, there's often people working there who are obviously in their 60s. Sometimes they're a bit older, but most supermarket jobs are part-time, and so that's obviously flexible for them. But the supermarkets are, and even at Bunnings, the big hardware chain in Australia, hires older people as well. And if you get hold of one, because they're all busy, they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I love it. I love that Bunnings actually have a dedicated sort of quotient for people, hiring people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And I believe they have people working there even into their 80s, and a while ago, someone in their 90s working at Bunnings. So they're an exemplar, I think.
I think we'll talk about that in a moment too. All right, one of the things, obviously the Wisepreneurs podcast is about independent professionals. It's people who have a professional qualification, they want to work for themselves, and they can be any age. For example, one of the ladies I spoke to, Hazel Edwards, recently 78, an author, said she's cut her working hours down from 60 to 35 hours a week. She's written 200 books. And she's quite involved in her work and her writing and presentations. She's written another book that she's about to publish shortly. So we have professionals out there who have looked after themselves and have got some good qualifications, but don't really want to retire, even though they might have retired from the workforce. What do you know about that sort of cohort?
Yeah, there are lots of people who, whether they're doing paid work or unpaid work, wanting to bestow their knowledge, also learn new things. That doesn't automatically stop in our 60s or 70s or what have you. In fact, I would say that retirement, the idea of retirement perhaps needs a reframe. Not to say that like those who want to finish that sort of 9 to 5 really hard type of work can't, but I would say that we need more institutions, whether it's TAFE or university, that kind of allows people to skill in a vocational way, perhaps in that transition from the 9 to 5 type work to a vocation or something, a new skill that they've always wanted to learn. I knew someone in the fashion industry who was tired of doing the 9 to 5 or later type role and went and did a florist course and then did that and then had their own business in the 60s kind of thing. My cousin actually is a really great example. She lives in the Philippines and worked as a lawyer for the Asian Development Bank for a very long time. And in the last probably 5 years of her work, she really loved dog training and dog behavior and helping people train their pets. And so in the last 5 years of her kind of career as a lawyer at the ADB, after work, she'd get changed into her chinos and her polo, and she'd go and start doing this dog training. And then basically on the last day of her work after 25 years, she just got into her gear and she just stepped straight into this other role that she transitioned to. And I'm not saying like it's so easy, but I think that people can do it, but I think that we're not set up well in society to help support that transition. And I think that the book, The 100-Year Life that you mentioned before, talks about the need for institutions to really start providing this type of support. And that type of support starts with the mentality and reframing it and reframing transitions from midlife into later life.
I think that's really important because I purchase online courses all the time. I don't always get time to do them, But there are ways that you can learn, and they don't have to be expensive either. Some of the online courses are fairly cheap, but I guess you'd have to have access to internet and stuff like that. And in local communities, are you finding that there is some sort of retraining programs out there that would help people, say, transition from work and maybe to find something else they could do, even if it was voluntary?
I have to say, I don't think I've seen a lot of that, because I'd probably be like onto who's doing it and what are the outcomes. And I know that there's the U3A, the University of the Third Age, for example. I'm not entirely sure if that sets up for training for new skills or anything. It probably does. I haven't had as much involvement. But I know that people who are quote unquote retired and want to continue to learn can access the University of the Third Age. I don't think that our mainstream institutions perhaps are doing as much around lifelong learning as they could. I know that in the US, although it's quite a elite university, Stanford, but they have got a lot of stuff on longevity, and a distinguished career institute where I believe younger and older people are paired, learn from one another and mentor one another. And I think that these sorts of things, multi-generational learning and transitioning and all that kind of stuff, really needs to be brought in as a mainstream thing into our universities. I know that the University of Queensland, for example, is part of the age-friendly global network of universities in the Southern Hemisphere, and the only one in Australia. And they're actually partnering with myself and some colleagues, a study that we're doing on actually trying to improve the attitudes towards older workers. So I think the answer is that yes, people are doing it individually, and I think that's going to help with the shift in the mindset, because they're showing people that it can be done. But it would be great if, as a society, we just got on board and said, you know what, we're living much longer now. We've got to do away with these age stereotypes that it's all about decline. It's not to say that aging isn't about decline. We know it is. Eventually we decline and die, but it's happening much later now. So we've got a good portion of our lives that we are really squandering because of poor attitudes.
Yeah, I think that is my biggest concern, because I think when you're younger, you think you're bulletproof, and it takes a while to start finding, I don't know, is it women who are finding themselves feeling the problem more because they start to looking older, and then they're starting to spend money on products to try and stay younger, and men don't really care? Is that an issue?
That's a whole other podcast about the way that sort of, I would almost say, the lie that women are sold that they have to look young all the time.
I love working with women because they're so smart and they actually work. And some of them, I do work with some men, but most of the women, they communicate really well. They get stuck into the work and things happen, which is really fantastic. That's why I love working with them. And obviously my cohort, that most of the women I'm working with now are in their 60s, and I fit in where I fit in, and it seems to, I become part of their team, I suppose you could say. Yeah, but it does concern me that women are feeling it more, I think, than men. And I don't know if that's Australian men, they don't really care.
Look, I don't think it's Australian men. I think overall, I don't want to just say Western culture, because beauty is a universal thing. But I think in Western culture, I'm going to say that it's getting a little better, but there is this sort of double whammy for women, this sort of a twin prejudice of ageism and sexism, right? That kind of creates double the barrier, I would say, for women. And it's not just my personal opinion. There's research that supports that. There's a lack of media representation for women over the age of 40. As I said, it's getting a little better, but traditionally we still have this view that women need to look 25 their whole lives. And so there's a billion, trillion, I don't know how many dollar business, but of women trying to meet that expectation, unfortunately.
I think it is unfortunate because the women I work with are so smart, and they're in their 60s, and it would be horrible if they were being ignored and not listened to. I recently spoke with a lady in her 70s, very highly qualified professional, and she was doing a consulting program, and she saw something wrong, and she said, look, there's something wrong here, and they didn't want to know because they had an ulterior motive, which is really sad. And that's the difficulty that they have. You can be in your 70s, have the expertise, but be ignored because they don't necessarily agree with you. And yet the person could have 20 or 30 or 40 years of solid experience at a very high executive level.
Look, I think there's a lot of things, there's a lot of dynamics going on, but stereotypes is a predominant thing. Ageism and sexism combined is the unfortunate negative force that women have to deal with. But also, as we get older, and this is, I think, quoting Gloria Steinem, who's a very prominent feminist, but as we get older, whether you're male or female, but females in particular, we are more vocal. We just say it like it is. And there's this sort of like expectation that women shouldn't be speaking their mind for whatever strange reason. So when they do, it's met with like dismissal and diminishing, whatever other things. I've been listening to the Wiser Than Me podcast. Have you listened to the Wiser Than Me podcast with Julia Louise-Dreyfus? It's a really good one, actually. It's just come out a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year when it came out. Yeah. And she interviews all these sort of older women. Gloria Steinem was one of them.
Wow. I don't think I'm going to get some of those people on my podcast.
You might, you never know.
My difficulty is finding, and anyone listening who does know somebody who's in their late 60s and 70s and 80s is still working could just contact me, and I'd love to interview them. I have reached out and asked, but it's hard to find them. But it's also hard for me to find Australians to talk to. I find it easier to talk to people across the world, no matter where they are, than to find my Australians that I can talk to. So let's have a little talk about aging and technology. Is that an issue?
I would say the attitudes around that are an issue. And I know people who have worked in technology who are being pushed out in their 40s and 50s because they're, again, it's the stereotype that you're some young digital native, as if older people can't be digital natives or learn technology either. My partner's a tech reviewer. He writes about tech, and he's all over technology, and he's in his 50s, and he knows how everything works immediately. There is this problem in that industry that we pair technology with use, and that's ridiculous because technology has been around and advancing so much in the last decade, and that we're all using it now. I find it really a little bit annoying and insulting when they say they're surprised that people in their 50s and 60s or 70s know how to use technology. My dad's 80 and he has emails and social media and uses a laptop and phone perfectly. Sure, some older people don't like technology, but they can learn it if they want to. It's not that they can't learn technology. Older people, I think there's research that shows older people can adopt technology. Sometimes if it's new to them, it might take a bit longer, but they can learn it. It's not that they're not capable of learning technology. Sorry, that's my rant.
Oh, no, that's good. One of the issues I have is that when people do leave their work and they want to work for themselves, they don't always understand the technology because they've had IT support in the business they've been working in. They've had an awful lot of support there, but when they go to work for themselves, they don't have that anymore. So there's a real gap.
I would say that might be the case, but I would probably say that younger people that don't have the IT tech support might also struggle.
Yeah, I had some real issues trying to connect up multiple screens to my Mac. I use a MacBook Pro, and now I've got 3 screens behind me plus the MacBook Pro, but trying to get them all to work together, it just takes ages to find it out. Whereas it would have been nice if there was somebody, because I live in a country town out of Geelong, it would have been nice to have somebody local to come around and, oh, you need this and this. I guess older people are not going to require what I require. So another issue too is, I think one of the things you mentioned is a built environment. Is that an issue that you see out there, the environment that we live in? It's not always suitable for older people?
Yeah, look, I think that universal design is a great thing, right? If we approached public spaces with the lens of universal design, such that whether you're older or maybe have a disability could be able to access that space, then everybody can access that space. And I think that there's some good examples of that type of approach, but I think we don't really have enough such that we could call ourselves having age-friendly cities like that. And I think what that leads to is not only obviously the concern and the higher risks of falls or things like that, but what it leads to is social isolation, right? People don't want to come to a place where There's minimal lighting. The footpaths aren't maintained, and the parking is non-existent or too expensive. It's astounding that we've known for the last 2 decades that we've got this thing called population aging, right? Where we're all, as a population, getting older, and yet we still don't have this front of mind when we're building things and facilities and stuff. Like I said, there's some good examples of that, but as a whole, I think we could be doing a lot better.
I agree. I got rid of my car. My wife still has her car. I prefer to use the bus. Now, I am in a small country town, so the bus doesn't go too often, but I can get to Melbourne. I can take the bus to the station, get the train to Melbourne, and believe it or not, it's about $4 during the week. And I love that because I get to read. Whereas if I had to drive, I just get so bored driving. But I can understand as I get older, you just get a little bit more frightened that you might have some problems or something, or somebody might not be friendly to you and things like that. So you can understand that, but you're stuck with the public transport and you hope that it's going to be safe and you hope that it's going to be clean. And I guess that's the other issue too, is the stereotypes. You're an old person. And now that I'm starting to look a bit older and I work really hard on my health, but I just know that when I look in the mirror, I'm not the same as I was when I was 50. One of the areas you work with is with prisoners and coming back out into the world. So can you tell us something about that? What are some of the issues that they have?
Yeah, so some of the research that I've done at UNSW was on the aging prisoner population. And obviously when we talk about built environment, when they're in prison, it's a whole other issue. But coming out, it's very hard for people who are older and haven't been integrated into society, particularly if they've been in prison for 10 years. And then we talked about the rate of technology and the speed of technology, and also just knowing the systems change all the time, whether it's to do with how to connect to Centrelink and what's required, and whether you can do it online or go to the office, and then pushing everything out into digital now. And then just social isolation and health concerns are big problems for this marginalised population. Yeah.
It must be pretty hard, I'd say, and especially if you're isolated from family. I would think that would be very difficult for them. And what ages are they coming out?
That varies a lot from the research that I've done. There's actually not quite a few, but there's a few different kinds of experiences for older prisoners. Some have been in there for a long time. Others have had difficult sort of lives and been in touch with the justice system since they were young and been cycling in and out of prison, or there's been violence in their family in their life, and so somehow they've ended up being in prison, or there's people who perhaps have committed crimes when they were younger but hasn't been found until later, and this type of thing. But what we know is that there is a premature form of aging when you're in that sort of group of marginalised populations.
That must be pretty hard, I think, especially finding somewhere to live and being able to earn some money. It must be difficult.
Yeah, it's very hard, particularly prisoners who were released during the pandemic. It was hard for the whole population was shut down. There was no networks there at all. It was very difficult. Yeah.
Now, we're probably coming to the end of the podcast. Is there something else that you would like to talk about? I was going to ask you about edgy elders. So tell me about edgy elders. What's that?
When I finished my postgraduate studies, I talked about cultural attitudes and so on. There was just so much that I felt we needed to talk about and shift. And edgy elders ended up being something that sort of hangs off my blog, Mobilising Wisdom. And it initially started with the blog because I had so much to say about different things about aging that I just started putting them into blog pieces, and then started interviewing other people who are talking about aging and trying to essentially disrupt age stereotypes. But in that also the sort of inner work, self-reflection component that often comes with maturity and as you get older. And it's really wanting to disrupt attitudes, transform a little bit, give people some sense of what positive aging looks like. And then edgy elders came along because I always had the idea that I wanted to put something out there in a tangible way that would start conversations whether it was just like a cheeky bumper sticker or a t-shirt or something. And so because my background initially was fashion, I just thought I'll just be easier to put together a little line of product. And that's what I did. And it hangs off my blog, which you can read about stuff, but you can also go onto the little shop, or I do markets as well, because I like to have conversations in person with people about some of the attitudes, like just the conversation I'm having with you. I sometimes have little snippets with people at the markets.
That's great. I had a look at that website. The T-shirts look fantastic, but I might buy one of those bags that are there. They look great too. Some fabulous products. Natasha, thanks for joining us. How would you like people to connect with you? I will put all this in the show notes where your blog is and where Edgy Elders can be found.
Yep.
But how else would you like people to connect with you?
Oh, look, they can find me through my blog. I've got like a little contact or Edgy Elders. And also, I just to mention that I am giving listeners a discount with a discount code that I've given you, which I put Edgy Friends 24, and that's for the next month. So I can get 10% off any of the products. And I might see you or listeners at some of the markets, Allura markets, Paddington markets, that I sometimes do on weekends.
Thank you for being on the Wisepreneurs podcast. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Nigel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Wisepreneurs podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please consider subscribing to the podcast, and if you're feeling generous, buy me a cup of coffee to keep me going. Thank you.